It's February 8, 1865. The Augustinian monk and talented educator Gregor Mendel presents the results of his latest research to the members of the Natural Science Society in Brno, today's Czech Republic. The subject of his work is the crossbreeding of pea plants. At that moment, it may not seem obvious, but it is a historic moment. Based on his experiments, Mendel will define the general laws of genetics, which will later prove to be valid not only for plants, but for the entire animal kingdom, including humans. Gregor Mendel made his discoveries 35 years before the discovery of chromosomes, which carry genetic information, and a century and a half before scientists were able to decode the pea genome he studied. Yet his conclusions are still valid today. Mendel's laws of genetics are, without exaggeration, the result of brilliant thinking, and remain one of the greatest scientific discoveries ever made in the Czech lands. Gregor Mendel was born in Hynčice, Silesia, in what was then the Austrian Empire. His father worked as a small farmer and had a clear idea for the future of his only son. Gregor would inherit the farm and continue his work. However, the local priest recognized the boy's talent and persuaded his mother, and later his father, to send their son to study. To save enough money for his education, they even decided to sacrifice the dowry of one of Gregor's two sisters. Gregor attended the gymnasium in Opava and then continued at the Philosophical Institute in Olomouc. Here, he came into contact with the Czech language for the first time, as the Mendel family, like most of the inhabitants of Silesia at the time, was German. Despite all of his parents' efforts, Gregor begins to run out of money at university. He tries to earn by tutoring his less gifted classmates. However, the strain and stress take their toll. Mendel, who apparently had a tendency toward neuroses, breaks down mentally and returns to his hometown for a year. Fortunately, after the priest who had opened the door to his studies, another good soul appears, his Professor Franz from the Philosophical Institute. He is determined that Gregor should not drop out. Since the centers of education and financial support at the time were monasteries, he recommends Mendel to the abbot of the Augustinian monastery in Brno, Cyril Franz Knapp. On the condition that he catches up on his Czech, the abbot accepts him, and at the age of 21, Mendel becomes a novice. 4 years later, in August 1847, he is ordained as a priest. As part of his spiritual duties, Mendel serves in a hospital, caring for seriously ill patients. However, he is experiencing another nervous breakdown. Abbot Knapp recounted, Mendel, when faced with the sight of the suffering, was overwhelmed by an insurmountable fear that brought him to the brink of dangerous mental illness. As a result, the abbot withdraws Mendel from the hospital and sends him to teach at a gymnasium in Znojmo. There, Gregor finds his calling. He teaches Greek, Latin, German, and mathematics, and his students adore him. His pedagogical talent is so evident that Abbot Knapp decides to send him to the University of Vienna to complete the education he had started in Olomouc, allowing him to fully devote himself to teaching. However, Mendel's fragile psyche strikes again. He is dismissed from his exams. The future founder of genetics fails in both physics and natural history. He returns to the monastery and struggles with low self-esteem. Abbot Knapp asks him to investigate the possibilities of wine breeding in the monastery garden. Gregor enjoys the work in the garden, so he immerses himself completely in it. Along with breeding, he takes up beekeeping and, his other hobby, meteorology. He works so thoughtfully and scientifically that he once again yearns for further education. Abbot Knapp still believes in him and sends him back to Vienna to continue his studies. Mendel is even more eager for knowledge. He studies plant physiology and, at the same time, mathematical analysis. Soon, the moment will come when he will manage to connect these two fields almost miraculously. Through his work with wine breeding, Mendel understands how inheritance works in plants. He chooses the pea plant as his experimental subject, where the results are clearly visible. Mendel is the first to discover the regularity in the occurrence of certain inherited traits, and what's more, he is able to express it numerically. He formulates 3 rules, which will later be known as Mendel's laws of inheritance. After 10 years of patient work with plant crossbreeding and comparing results, he finally decides to publish his conclusions. He releases a study titled Experiments with Plant Hybrids. By this time, Mendel is an recognized breeder and even a member of the Natural Science Society. He is accepted into the society despite the fact that, like in Vienna, he did not complete the final exams. It is speculated that either he once again struggled mentally or, perhaps more likely, his conclusions had outpaced the scientific knowledge of the time and he disagreed with the examination board, which rejected his arguments. On February 8, 1865, he presents his groundbreaking lecture on pea inheritance before the Natural Science Society in Brno. However, instead of recognition, he faces skepticism. His use of mathematical and statistical models is understood by only a few. It gets to the point where the uncertain Mendel begins to doubt his own conclusions. Fortunately, his lecture is published even abroad, in Germany, the Netherlands, and Austria. Other scientists researching cell structure revisit Mendel's studies and confirm his conclusions. However, for him personally, this does not lead to world recognition. It comes only at the beginning of the 20th century, by which time Gregor Mendel has been dead. Nevertheless, Mendel left this world as a highly respected figure. After the death of his great supporter, Cyril Franz Knapp, he became the abbot of the Augustinian monastery and also worked as the director of the mortgage bank for a time. In addition, he was a respected breeder, beekeeper, and even a meteorologist, who was the first to describe the formation of tornadoes. Gregor Mendel died on January 6, 1884, from a kidney infection. The requiem at his funeral was conducted by then young Leos Janáček. And it is a cruel irony of fate that none of the mourners were aware that they were actually bidding farewell to the brilliant discoverer whose conclusions were ahead of their time by decades and would become the foundation of an entirely new scientific field, genetics.